Okay, here we are. Students, so I'm going to try my best to go over these respiratory system notes with you. I'm recording from my home. Hope everybody's doing well. My advice to you is to study these notes really well, obviously, and these lectures are going to enhance and add to the notes. Just so you're aware, everything in the chapters are game for these exams from this point forward. So it's not just what's on the notes, it's also what I'm going to say, and also what I'm going to draw on the board behind me. So let's get going. The goal of the respiratory system is cellular respiration. What that means is the whole reason that we inhale oxygen is so that we can get it to our cells so our cells can use it. And then as a byproduct of that, our cells give off carbon dioxide as an exhaust that we need to get rid of. It's not good for our bodies. It's poisonous to our bodies. So we intake oxygen, take that, the cardiovascular system actually takes that oxygen to our cells. The cells use it, produce CO2. Blood takes it, cardiovascular system takes it back to our lungs where we expel the CO2. So there's four main steps to respiration. The first one is pulmonary ventilation. That's just a fancy way of saying breathing, or the movement of air in and out of the lungs. That one, pulmonary ventilation, step one, is associated with the volume called tidal volume. I'll talk about that later. The second step of respiration is external respiration. In short, what that means is what's happening in the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation is actually moving air from the atmosphere into our lungs. External respiration is then what happens to that air when it gets to our lungs, the little tiny air sacs in our lungs called alveoli. And what happens in external respiration is we move oxygen from the air spaces in our lungs into the blood of the pulmonary capillaries. So we're going from airspace to blood. The third step of respiration is transport of oxygen and CO2 in the blood. So we take oxygen from the pulmonary capillaries to our cells in our body, and then we take CO2 from the cells in our body back to the lungs to be expired. And step number four, internal respiration. Internal respiration is what happens to that oxygen when it gets to the systemic capillaries. For example, oxygen, we inhale it. During external respiration, it goes into the pulmonary capillaries, and then the cardiovascular system transports that oxygen to our cells. So internal respiration is actually oxygen diffusing out of the systemic capillary blood into the interstitial space, that means between the cells, and then our cells use that oxygen actually diffuses into the cells to be used. Our cells then produce CO2. That CO2 travels from the cells through the interstitial space to the systemic capillary blood, and then the cardiovascular system takes it back to our lungs where we exhale. Upper respiratory system. Everything superior to the larynx. The larynx is the voice box, or what you and I call the Adam's apple right here. That's where our larynx is located. The upper respiratory system is everything from this point up. The lower respiratory system technically includes the larynx, and it's everything down to our lungs. So structures of the upper respiratory system, I've just listed anatomy. The nose, or the scientific name for the nostrils, is nares. The nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, which are just air spaces located in the bones of the skull, the cranial plates. The pharynx, which means throat. It's just a scientific name for throat. There's three sections to the pharynx: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Those different sections to the pharynx get their names just based on their location. The respiratory zone, in quotation marks on my notes, that just refers to anywhere in the respiratory system where there's actually gas exchange occurring. Most of it occurs in the alveoli. So wherever there's alveoli present, alveoli are just names for the tiny air sacs or gas exchange occurs. Wherever we have the presence of alveoli, that's called a respiratory zone. The conducting zones are actually the absence of alveoli. So anything that just transports air is called a conducting zone wherever gas exchange does not occur. The nasal cavity. These are just structures that we find within the nasal cavity. If I were to draw a picture behind me, the nasal cavity looks something like this. This is the profile of the head. The nasal cavity, if air comes in the nares or the nostril, the nasal cavity is located in this space right here, sort of just posterior to the nose. So this is the nasal cavity. There's structures in the nasal cavity. First, this cavity is lined with two types of mucosa. Those are just layers of tissue. There are layers of tissue within the respiratory system, and when we discuss the digestive system later, layers of tissue just means most superficial, what's below that or deep to that, and we call those layers of tissue mucosa, submucosa, so on and so forth. So when we talk about layers of tissue in the nasal cavity, there are two types of mucosa tissue. Those are the ones that are the closest to the air spaces, lining the spaces. There's an olfactory mucosa and a respiratory mucosa within the nasal cavity. The olfactory mucosa is the superior part of the nasal cavity. So up here, the lining up here is the mucosal, the olfactory mucosa lining that cavity, and it contains an olfactory epithelium with smell receptors, olfactory sensory receptors. The respiratory mucosa lines most of this middle and lower part of the nasal cavity. The respiratory mucosa is made up of pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. That goes back to AMP1. I'm not going to rehash exactly what that type of tissue is, but that's the type of tissue you will need to know that lines the respiratory mucosa of the nasal cavity. Within that respiratory mucosa, that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, they are ciliated to move debris back out of our respiratory system that we inhale. And also, there's a secretion function of that mucosa as well. There's goblet cells found in that mucosa that secrete a watery-based mucus. There's also glands found in that respiratory mucosa. These glands secrete not only the watery-based mucus, but substances called lysozymes, which technically are enzymes that fight bacteria. And there's also a class of chemicals that are secreted in that mucus called defensins. That's just sort of a generic name for an antimicrobial agent. Also, within this nasal cavity, there are structures called nasal conchae or conchae, depending on how you pronounce it, it doesn't matter. Those nasal conchae are just folds of tissue, and they sort of look like Roman blinds over a window. They hang down like this. There's a superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. And what they do is they increase surface area, they swirl, moisten, and warm incoming air. So when air comes in, when we inhale, it gets swirled, warmed, and moistened here by those nasal conchae. The spaces between those nasal conchae, singular, is called a nasal meatus. So in these folds, in the space of the folds, we call that space a nasal meatus. The actual tissue itself is a nasal conchae. You can't see this board very well. I apologize, there's lots of glare in this room. We'll just have to go with it. The pharynx, or the throat, there are three sections to the pharynx. So I'll outline that on the board here. Air comes in, swirls around in the nasal cavity, and then posterior to the nasal cavity back here is an area called the nasopharynx. And then below that is the oropharynx. And these are just named for the cavities which they lie behind. The nasopharynx is the part of the throat that sits behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is the part of the throat that sits behind the oral cavity. What really separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity is the hard palate right here. That's the maxilla, the maxillary bone, or the palatine process of the maxilla and the palatine bone. Then traveling, we're just tracing a molecule of air as we inhale it. It comes in, swirls in the nasal cavity, travels back to the nasopharynx, then down through the oropharynx, and finally near this larynx, which is the voice box, the Adam's apple right here. This part of the throat is called the laryngopharynx. So these fancy names are just sections of the throat, really. The nasopharynx is for air passage only. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are for air passage and food. What will happen down here near the larynx, this is where food and air gets separated, where air gets forced down our trachea, and food then can go down the esophagus, which sits behind the thing. Also located in, specifically in this sort of nasopharynx, oropharynx area are some other structures, particularly mucosal associated lymphoid tissue, which we learned with the immune system. Things like tonsils, sets of tonsils are located right here. They have an antimicrobial defensive type of function to them. Next on the notes, the larynx, or the voice box. That's down here. The larynx is this structure, this hard structure that we feel at our Adam's apple. The reason that it feels hard and it protrudes from our neck is because it's made up of 9 cartilage plates. So it's just sections, pieces of cartilage that are sort of placed together to create this voice box type of structure. All 9 of the cartilage plates that make up the larynx are made of hyaline cartilage, the type of tissue, except for 1. So 8 of the 9 are hyaline cartilage. 1 of the 9 is made of elastic cartilage. I'm going to talk about those for a minute. First, the function of the larynx is sort of twofold. It's to separate air from food, which I mentioned earlier. It also is the place where we produce sound. So it's for voice production. The one cartilage plate that is made up of elastic cartilage, the epiglottis, is just a flap of tissue that folds over the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea, when we swallow food. We don't want food going down into our trachea, to our respiratory system. So the larynx is structured something like this. If I keep in this profile image, the larynx is this box shape of cartilage like this. Air comes down here into the trachea, which is just a tooth. We don't want food. Here's a particle of food that we're swallowing. We don't want food going down into the larynx, into the trachea, and lodging in there, because we would choke, we would suffocate to death. We want the food to be forced behind the trachea into the esophagus, which is a tube right here, the digestive system. What keeps food from going down into the trachea is this flap. It's like a trap door that's open like this when we're breathing. And then when we swallow food, this door shuts or slams shut down here to close off the trachea so that the food gets forced down into the esophagus. The glottis is just a fancy name for the opening to the trachea right here. So the glottis is an opening, a hole, the top of the trachea that's found within the larynx. Now down here in this part, up here, we have stratified squamous epithelium lining all of these cavities in the upper respiratory system. And the larynx is really, most of the larynx is lined with stratified squamous epithelial cells as well. That is always for protection. So inside of our mouths inside of our upper respiratory system, and inside of the larynx, we have stratified squamous epithelial cells. It's abrasion resistance. It's for protection. Next, I'm going to talk about the trachea, then we'll take a break, and I'll continue with a separate video. Before I get to the trachea, the last thing I'm going to say about the larynx is you do need to know the different cartilage plates found within the larynx. So add this to your notes. There's the thyroid cartilage. These are all in your textbook. The thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. Those are two separate cartilages. Then the next cartilages come in pairs and sets. There's two arytenoid cartilages, and those control the vocal cords and the vocal folds. There's two corniculate cartilages. They actually sit right on top of the arytenoids. And finally, two cuneiform cartilages. Those are at the base of the epiglottis. So we've got thyroid, cricoid, two arytenoid, two corniculate, two cuneiform, and if you're counting, that's 8. And then the last cartilage in the larynx is the epiglottis itself. That's the only one that's made of elastic cartilage tissue. All right, I'm going to cut it short here just because this has been about a 15-minute video, and then I'll continue with the next one. So stay tuned.